The intention really was to talk about just to extend the sort of personal journey that I've had in my time using the EVS system or the interactive response system. Looking at some different applications that we've used it for and sort of talking a little bit about each of those and give you a chance to experience each of those. Talk a little bit about the students, what feedback we've had on each of those, and the sort of final part at the end there is like summative assessment is where I'm heading towards at the moment. I've had quite a few anxieties about that, and I thought if I share that with you, perhaps I might have some ideas that would help me out too. So this might be a bit hard. I know that I used first thing this morning. Just if you could just respond to that, to give you some idea if you currently do use it in teaching at all. The majority do, so obviously I think a lot of people have a lot of experience perhaps in this area already, so I think the starting point here might be a little bit simplistic for you. Think back to the first thing this morning when you first arrived, at the point before anything had happened, and answer this question from that perspective, if you would please. We'll come back to this actually right at the end, so we'll skip by that for now. This is how the scale is at the moment. We'll come back to this at the very end. But the majority of people do feel quite strongly about how they use it in their practice, which is really good. The rationale for introducing the EVS, basically we had quite small cohorts of students. We used to teaching sort of about 40, 50 students in a cohort. And then suddenly we achieved a contract from a different institution to do radiography education for them. And so our numbers kind of jumped suddenly from 40 to 150. And it's quite a difficult transition at that time. We had a lot of the things we used to do were you could break 40 down into small groups very easily. A lot of the teaching was very small group oriented teaching. And now some of the 150, logistically trying to break that down to small groups was harder. We felt very aware that with the larger numbers there's a lot less interaction happening in the classrooms with the sort of increased numbers. And also with the sort of the subject that we teach, the cohorts we have are very diverse in terms of both sort of ethnicity and cultural backgrounds, also sort of age backgrounds as well. We have a very sort of quite a core sort of mature student element as well as a younger element. So it's very diverse, and interactivity was kind of, we felt, was becoming less and less apparent in lecture settings. And it's harder to get interactivity in the larger sort of lecture settings. So it was looking really at a way of trying to increase interactivity initially was one of the drivers to sort of introduce the EVS. In looking into it, the advantages I think have been spoken by pretty much everybody along the way today, and certainly just to reiterate those things here is that it certainly increased the engagement in face-to-face settings. As I'm sure you're aware as you use it in your own teaching practices, when you come up to a question slide, there's a sudden sort of snap to attention almost, and there's clickers at ready, they're starting to anticipate the question that's coming. So it certainly does increase the interactivity and the anticipation interactivity with the content. It's great that it gives the immediate feedback. They can see, and it gives us the opportunity to address those with the students in the classroom. And if there's any misunderstandings of the content there, then that can be addressed also. It's quite useful that they can be used for support exam preparation. Particularly suitable probably where the assessment method in the module would be a multiple choice examination. Then having multiple choice sessions along the way using the EVS, a good preparation for students in preparing for that. Because also then when you do feedback along the way to what's the right answer and the wrong answer, you also look at, say, you can talk about the construction of multiple choice questions as well, and be very careful how you look at the question. So you can also use it in preparation to help people to look at how they would address multiple choice questions and how they would approach multiple choice questions generally. So it's very sort of suitable really for that setting as well. Just to begin with, as we would just initially, when we first purchased the EVS, we'd think about interspersing some general multiple choice questions along the way, just to check the students' understanding of the content. So we just had some very basic, I guess, here, multiple choice questions first of all. These were initially very health oriented, and I actually tried to pull away from that, make them a bit more general knowledge-y. So these are simply just multiple choice questions. There's one or two points to sort of just make with these. Excellent result there. Do you all use the correct very familiar with. I think that's always like the moment of anticipation when you first put this slide to students and they're looking at this. There's still a little fair, it's quiet in the room, nobody says anything at this point. And it's not really until the sort of last click comes up and the answer sort of comes up that they suddenly go, yes! And even if there is quite a range of answers there, and perhaps not everyone's got the answer right, when the answer comes up, they tend to always like an impression, yes, I did get the answer right, because at least they've preserved their sort of face in front of their peers, which I think is one of the biggest real student favours of using EVS. It's the thing that often students quote the highest when they talk about feedback on using EVS, is how much they like that anonymity and not being stupid in front of their peers. There's a couple more questions of this, just very quick then here, these just sort of random questions to go through. I have to think about this one actually.
It's the only square number.
Interesting spread. But the correct answer is? Correct. So the job is to yes.
Correct time for us, born.
There's just one last one I think there. Big spread in the correct answer. Again, majority correct. That one there. Is everyone familiar with generating reports? Do you routinely sort of generate reports? I think most of you probably do know, perhaps you're aware how that's kind of easily achieved. Just to do so then here, you just click on report. And you select by what method you want to create a report, and then just generate a report. It's really quick and easy to do. I think that's one of the advantages here, is that you can get generic feedback to do it very quickly. It takes just a couple of moments to generate a report, and then you get this very nice, obviously, as you're all familiar with, I'm sure yourselves. I think one of the good things about it, and you're no doubt all aware about that, you get the correct answer indicated on your answers there and the breakdown graph. So as far as generic feedback to student goes, it's very quickly, you can post that on the VLE and then they can go back and review that in light of the sort of feedback there. So generic reports are very quick and easy, as you know, sort of quickness of feedback, speed of feedback is something that students very much like as well. So when the chance to go back and review the answers, just we do the graphs in class and we talk about that and discuss the options there. But having that to be able to go back to, refer back to and look back on the slides, the students very much like that opportunity. As I say, it's first introduced. When we first introduced it, we were thinking very much along the lines of there's quite a strong perception, I think, in healthcare that mature students are very anti-technology and not so familiar with computers, using computers or different types of technology. So initially thinking about, when you thought about the EVS, would it appeal to students universally? Would some students feel disadvantaged by having to use these? How easy are they to use? Do students really see the point to them? So we did, after the first initial use of it, we did sort of an evaluation with the students to see how they perceived the use of the EVS. And basically the mature students saw it no differently than the direct entry students, so there's no kind of barriers, it turns out, really, with age in there at all. What's quite useful was that the students perceived it as helping them to learn. 92.5% there, of students perceived it as being beneficial for their learning, which I think is a real good point again for the students' perception, the students' viewpoint of the system, is that they perceived it as being very beneficial for their learning too. And also useful for exam preparation. We first introduced it in a module whereby the assessment was multiple choice exam. So from the word go, we were saying this is all, every time we use this now, it's preparation, it's preparing you for the exam. And they saw that and saw that as being beneficial along the way as well, and saw the use of the EVS being beneficial there. So the students' comments, and again it kind of really just reiterates the things that people have been saying really throughout the day, from day to day, is that students say, oh, so you don't feel stupid when you get one wrong and you lie and you say you got it right. Lets me know my weakness and help me to learn what I need to look up. Things that often come through, I'm sure you come through as well, students see it as being fun. They see that using the handsets and voting is kind of fun activity for them. So moving on from that, so initially we first had it just used very anonymously within a classroom setting. We wanted to sort of move on to then think about, could we assign them independent handsets? Could it be used really then to sort of like monitor the students throughout the module, and to see really whether that was actually had any effect on perhaps the end of module marks at the end of the day. It was also for students to also, when it was sold to the students or how it was getting the students on board with the idea, was that it enables them to monitor themselves throughout the module. So there's a number of the EVS tests along the way before the final multiple choice exam. And this is an opportunity for you to track yourself throughout the module and see how you're doing. So it's done very much along the lines of kind of more monitoring yourself than we are monitoring you. And it was we didn't say to the students that we would be following you up as a result of this, but if you felt that then you're below the average mark and that you're not doing well, then you could come forward to us for support. So we didn't actually use it to approach them, but just they could approach us if they felt they needed to. We wanted to see whether sort of the scores at the tests would affect the end of module mark, or whether the fact they turned up for the test in itself, would that be a predictor of success at the final exam. A technical shortcomings in the most prized practice attendance in itself didn't turn out to be a predictor of success at summative assessment. Those that achieved well, consistently well throughout the preparatory tests, did achieve higher scores at summative assessment. Overall, across the year group, there was an increase in average mark across the year group. We can't really claim statistical significance in this because the prior year only really didn't have this sort of system, so we didn't have a lot of data to compare. But there was an increased average mark and a more normal distribution of marks, where previously there was a significant number in our fail area. There's now more sort of normal distribution marks across the range. Another thing that we moved on to look at was something called conditional branching. In sort of healthcare, it's quite useful, particularly in diagnostic radiography, where you use ionising radiation. You can't actually radiate patients at random and see what happens and try out different ideas. It's not a very ethical thing to do. But there's a lot of decisions that have to be made, and it's quite difficult to try and get students to understand the decision-making process and at what points they're making decisions and why. So what we did was construct a range of different scenarios. And what the conditional branching feature in TurningPoint does is that you can select either by a majority decision or minority. And what happens is that the sequence of the slides gets changed based on that decision. So you can look at different routes and different along scenarios, just basically take it down different routes based on what the students are thinking. Either to an endpoint where you can't achieve a diagnosis or the patient dies, or down a correct route. So we sort of started looking into this idea next. We thought we'd try this idea out, is using this to help facilitate sort of decision-making skills in students. This isn't one for you to try, we've got one for you to try out here, but this is first of all just talking you through it to kind of get the idea across to you. It just starts out with a little bit of information here. It starts out 61-year-old male, visits his GP with chronic pain in his right hip. He gets referred for a pelvis x-ray, so then they would get a pelvis x-ray here. And there'd be a question on there, then they've got to decide, is this x-ray normal or is it abnormal? So they've got to make a decision at this point, first of all now, to say, right, do I think it's normal? Do I think it's abnormal? And they'll then make their vote on here. Depending on how they vote, will now depend on what next slide comes up. In this instance, 75% have said it's not a normal radiograph. So it's now going to go down that particular route, whereas if the majority had said, yes, it is a normal radiograph, it would have gone down a different route at this point. So what's happening? So when now the next slide that gets presented will just illustrate the next step down this abnormal route. So it's saying, yes, this pelvis radiograph is abnormal. How do you describe the image appearances? And there's a couple of options here. Is suggesting multiple lytic and sclerotic lesions, or there's a mass adjacent to the right hip. And again, they've got to look at this and try and make a decision as to what they think the correct answer is. And again, depending on what they select, is the route that this is now going to take again. In this case, the majority said it is mass adjacent to the right hip. That's actually an incorrect answer. So it's taken, this is kind of the end point for this branch, as it were, here. It's very sort of cut down little example. To say that no, that's incorrect, there's not a mass adjacent to the right hip. And in this example, you wouldn't have achieved a correct diagnosis. And that would kind of take it to the end of that little exercise, if you like. What's quite good there is that you can then just tag on some extra information, sort of the teaching information that goes with it. So they were saying, right, it shows bone metastases, and then there's some information about that to talk to the students about and talk them through that there. So that kind of was that little scenario. What I'll do is a live one with you here. Apologies if it's healthcare, you may not. Hopefully you get the idea of the process. That's the point, I guess, you get the idea of getting the process behind it. So we'll just experience it as it happens and see what you think. A 32-year-old man falls on his outstretched hand and feels pain in his wrist. Attending A&E, the doctor refers the patient for an X-ray of his left wrist. Great. Now, so he goes and has an X-ray of his wrist, and the X-ray shows no abnormality. So at this point, there's a decision to be made. Either the patient's discharged, there's no abnormality, or the doctor re-evaluates the image and then re-evaluates the patient in the light of it. So if you select at this point an option, the doctor is saying that the patient gets re-examined, liking this so far, this is all very encouraging. So it goes straight on to the idea of the patient being re-examined. So we've now gone down that route as opposed to the other route. So the doctor discovers that the patient has pain in the ASB, is the anatomical snuff box. What does he do next? So at this point, the doctor either say the patient's discharged or is going to request specialist views of the scaphoid. Again, make a response. Don't request, this is very encouraging, don't request scaphoid views. Oh, great. The scaphoid views are normal. So what will the doctor do now? Will he put the patient in plaster and review them? Will he discharge the patient? We're also now saying discharge the patient. So it goes straight down, hopefully goes straight down that route. Great, patients have been discharged. They experience ongoing pain and progressive decreased range of movements. As a result of that, he then revisits his GP in 6 months' time and is re-X-rayed at that point, at which point it's discovered he's got what's called avascular necrosis. If a patient has a fractured scaphoid that goes undiagnosed and untreated, they can get what's called avascular necrosis. There's a small blood vessel that goes through the scaphoid. The blood flow gets cut off and it then, basically the bone tissue dies, it leads to arthritis in later life. Essentially that was the wrong answer at this point. They should have been plastered, sent away, come back in 10 days' time. There is a reason for that. The reason is that you can, not all scaphoid fractures don't always show initially. But if they're left for about 10 days, bone starts to reform, and you'd see that reformed bone where there's a fracture. So you can then actually have it treated if you see that reformed bone. You went about 3/4 way through that decision-making tree very appropriately, which is very encouraging, because we didn't jump straight from beginning to end, so I was quite pleased by that. What's your feeling about going through the process of just doing that?
Did the students did they have any information about this before? Had they read anything, or did you have a lecture about this?
There was a previous lecture on... yes,
for example, scaphoid fractures?
Yes.
It was a lecture before?
Yes, yeah. And also imagery sessions together with that as well, and then this was kind of a review scenario session at the end. There was a number of scenarios there at the end.
So how many scenarios would they be run through? Because if they weren't being run through very many, logic alone would tell me it's unlikely to be just a straight discharge.
How do you mean, sorry?
So how many scenarios did they run through?
Which of these
this cohort of this multiple choice type?
Oh, this type. Sorry, it used to do 3 in a session. We do 3 in a session.
Right. So that over the course of their course, they'll do quite a lot.
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Any other sort of feelings about having gone through it?
Yeah, what about the number of question responses? So there were only 2 at any point. I think could be.
We did have this is again, this is kind of very oversimplified one actually brought here. Several I don't mean it like that, that sounds really bad.
How did you program this? I mean, is it the next slide is dependent on the answer, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to ask. How
you set it up is it under tools or is it insert? It's there somewhere, isn't it? Which one? It's one of those options. Yeah. It's actually very straightforward because you literally just put the link from wherever on the slide you want to link to. You then get a list and you can just select the list where you want to link it to.
So sorry, what for reading slow? It's tools, insert.
So it's tools, conditional branching.
Conditional branching.
Yes. Yeah. And then you select either majority or minority.
Okay.
And what you want the action to be, so link to slide, whatever number.
Just to jump in on that, if you do want to know how to do this, on the turningtechnologies.co.uk website, there's some links to video files that run you through how to set up these questions. So they last a couple of minutes and they'll talk you through exactly how to set everything up.
Initially, I think we started off with also, I think one of the things that reflection points are really good is perhaps quite a complicated one we started off in a way. And students initially didn't like it. And the reason they didn't like it was they loved the instant right or wrong. I'm right, I'm wrong. They didn't like this 20 minutes of uncertainty as we were going down different routes. And so one of the things we kind of learned from this, I think from a lecturing or tutoring point of view, it's a very valid exercise to do, it's a very good thing to do. But the students kind of, it's 20 minutes of I haven't got the faintest idea whether it's right or wrong, you know, I'm not getting that kind of instant feedback.
But isn't that like being a normal doctor anyway? So
it is
realistic?
Yes, it is, yeah, it's very, I think very realistic. What we learned, what we did from this, we went back to the point where we used to put little summaries at the end, reviewing why this is the correct choice, selected or whatever, and also look at each of the other branches. So we was built in this little summary at the end of each of the scenarios then.
Did the students have an opportunity to discuss a teacher, keep what sort of the teacher know, if you like, or was it a decision that everyone made on their own?
Initially, it's a decision they all made on their own.
Mm-hmm.
They tended to discuss them anyway. It has to be said they would tend to discuss it anyway. They would definitely be varying and perhaps give them one between 2,
Right.
and actually then deciding amongst themselves and giving reasons to each other why, to select the appropriate answers. There could be some merit certainly in doing this as 1 between 2. As time went on, was starting to use this. I think once it did it more often, students became more familiar with it and sort of liked these more. And particularly, I think then because we put these summaries in there that explained reasons why what was correct, but also looked at the incorrect routes as well and what was in there. They started to feel they got more out of it. So that was kind of a good learning point, really, from our point of view. It was just having these blind scenarios that went on for sort of 20, 25 minutes could be kind of confusing to students, and they got quite a lot of uncertainty with them. But now with the summaries in place, they like them, which is great. So that's quite a good thing, I think, hopefully for them there. It was strange because they felt then they were driving the situation as well, so they felt then that it's becoming more active here now because I'm in control of what's happening next and what slides are coming up next. It also gave a nice bit of variety in there. As I say, it's interesting, perhaps, as we would say pedagogically, the least valuable might be the simple right, wrong, multiple choice questions. And yet that's their preferred method, really. And yet this one then gave them more of an active role to consider their decision making and the points at which they were making the different decisions. So they kind of felt they were much more empowered, as it were, to be an active part of the lectures themselves. It also gave a bit of variety to the teaching. You can talk through scenarios and talk about different decision-making concepts. But being able to do that, using EVS to do that, is quite a nice way of being able to explore the different decision-making options at different points.
How much effort goes into creating a really decent branched conditional thing? Because
Well, shame you've asked that question. It can be quite a long time, depending on the complexity of the different branches. Branches could potentially initially branch off, but maybe then meet up later on. So you couldn't necessarily, you might need to link them back later on. The more complex the scenario, the more you've got to think about. Almost doing it as a decision tree is quite a good way of doing it at the starting point of where the decisions are, and actually mapping the branches out on paper before you do it is probably a good idea, because then you could then see what slides are where and what numbers there were to link into. So it's quite a good idea to kind of map that stage by stage out first of all. So it actually got better as we got more familiar with it as well. The first one or two were quite complicated, quite difficult. But I think we tried to make it very complicated to a certain extent. As we became more familiar with using it, it became easier for us. And we actually found we tend to do more simplified kind of options as well.
So how many levels do you go through typically?
It can vary. It's gone from about 5 or 6 levels up to about 15, 20, thereabouts. But again, the danger in a way sometimes is that there's almost like loss of sight of where it's going, which is quite. So if this is going for 40 minutes of a scenario, it kind of then gets really confusing. So I think in a way it's kind of got kept fairly contained, and then give plenty of time for discussion and feedback. And having summaries definitely helped really with the use of them.
Is it possible to loop back?
Yes, you could loop back and reset and then say, right, deliberately go down this path
Yeah.
now. That's what we did first of all. Before we thought about doing summaries, we thought, well, yeah, we've got to do something now then to try and explain that. So we actually went back to the beginning and reset the slides.
Which it's obviously more likely if you've got 4 or 5 potential pathways, you might want to say, well, Dr. Whitman, try this first, then this, then this.
Yeah, it would be quite good time to drive it down each of the branches. So by doing a summary, it's kind of simplifying at the end. And they wouldn't be sort of complex slides at the end, it'd just be a summary of what was in the branches and why they were the incorrect choices. Other things we have done on here, it's always going back to sort of the first idea of multiple choice questions to a certain extent, was how many of you use the EDS for team working in teams? You could assign handsets for team names or team numbers. One of the things we had was teams that work in groups, like tutor groups throughout the year, and so they'll do lab sessions by group. Group 1 will do lab sessions here, and Group 2 will be doing individual, and then they swap. And so we had them in teams in a way throughout the year, so we thought one time we'd try this and actually assign teams to handsets, to have working in teams with 1 handset per team. And because one of the things that's quite nice on the slides is that you can have slides that build themselves up as like leaderboards and scoreboards. And it's quite interesting that introducing an element of competition into groups was quite useful. And sometimes when you do group work, there's some that don't really, they kind of hang back in a group, they're kind of reluctant. When it all became a competition, they were very much more active in trying to participate. There's a real competition as it's going throughout the year then, using teamwork and using the team slides. And if you haven't tried it, I would encourage you to say that you do group work with, it's quite a nice thing to try, the motivation. One of the things I'm about to move into, I'm feeling quite nervous and anxious about this to a certain extent. I feel very comfortable with the technology, I feel I've used it very nicely for quite a period of time, but I haven't really used it for summative purposes until now. The sort of rationale for doing this is increased turnaround for marking times is one. There's a requirement to try and get feedback quickly to students to turn marking around much more quickly. And so I'm thinking, well, the EVS would be ideally suited for doing this. If we can just do this electronically quickly, then it cuts out a lot of time for actually sitting down and to mark paper copies of things. So that's kind of rationale for trying to do this, and thinking, well, yes, we should engage in doing this. And also one of the things that's being pushed quite largely our institution at the moment is the idea of staged assessments as well. We're aware of some of the modules we have a lot of content, and yet the assessment is kind of a 2-hour exam at the end of the module, when they're kind of folders of this thick, they've got to learn this material to try and either guess what's in that 2-hour exam. And to some respect, there can be quite high failure rates to some exams. So what we're looking at is having this idea, perhaps what we're doing, we will do stage assessments using the EVS. It shouldn't be a marking burden on the staff by doing that. And so therefore we're going to I thought kind of long and hard about how I'm going to try and think about all the loopholes there could be for cheating and ways around it, and I'm trying to think how I can construct something that's going to be workable and foolproof. I'm not entirely sure this is foolproof, so I'm looking for a bit of feedback here from also you on this aspect here. This is a mock now of what they're going to be getting. I'll just give you kind of one or two slides out of this to give you again. So this will be what they're going to experience when they come to do it. So you'll experience it now as they are. This is the first in-course test on imaging safety guidelines. I'm going to get them initially to check the clickers are working. Because there could be this allegation that they could simply not answer the question and say, well, my clicker wasn't working. So I've got to have this idea of that they press button right at the beginning, and I can then check back. One of the functions in there is you can click a response grid, which will bring up a response grid of the handset numbers. So I can show at the beginning, I can then just check and say, right, yes, all your handsets are working. So right, you're in this exam now, your handsets are all fine, they're all working. That's my rationale behind this. You can also do polling tests. I'm not sure if you're aware. You can do polling tests to check handsets are all working as well. And as they respond in polling test, it brings up the ID number. So my idea is to have this method where you just check quickly then the list to make sure that all the numbers are shown.
Alan, how many people will be doing the test at one time?
There'll be 97 doing in the main room. We've got like a breakout, another room of people who have learning needs agreements have to have longer time to do assessments. And also one or two need to have questions read to them, so actually they have a second group where they'll have it read to them and have slightly longer to do it. So the main group will be sort of 96, 97. Having established that, then I should be able to say, right, great, your handsets are now working, so we can move on. The in-course test is, in reality, it's going to consist of 20 questions. So they're going to have 20 questions from each of 4 imaging modalities. So they'll have in the real test, there'll be 5 questions for ultrasound, 5 questions for MRI, 5 for CT and 5 for RNI. They're going to have 1 minute to answer each question. For each part, I think it's the correct answer. And then we'll also be made aware that, of course, you'll accept their last answer. So if they do change their minds, they can do so within the time frame of the question. So first of all, I haven't denied as to whether to mix the questions up completely or to keep it. I actually thought at the end to keep it in subsections, because I think that's their mind. If they think, right, this section's about one modality, if it just jumped around all over the place, it might be hard for them to follow. So we kind of grouped it into each of the modalities. Have a go. So this is the first question. This time it's got the clock counter on it. It's quite a long time, isn't it? There's a lot of other areas as to whether it should be a shorter period of time, or whether they should have long. We set on a minute in the end, thinking a minute's long enough to sit and think, to make a choice, to change a choice if they need to. But they're used to, and we're used to, and they're used to a much quicker frame of reference here. So I did this with the formative one that I did with them to let them experience it as it's going to feel. Because it does feel very odd and dreamlike that you kind of sit there, each question will be a minute. This will take 20 minutes in total of slides at this kind of pace.
The other version I've seen is where the students get all the questions on a piece of paper and they're allowed to sit for 10 minutes.
Right.
And they can then think in their own time. So if you're stuck on question 1, you can spend longer, or you can move on. And then the voting is just done at the end to collect the answers in.
Yeah,
so that might accommodate for people needing different lengths of time.
That's interesting, thank you for that.
Yeah, I think you run a real risk with this is if I've got all the MRI questions and there's one on there I think, oh, what is that? And maybe I'm mistaking it for the CT one, and I come onto a CT and that reminds me, I've got no way of changing my first answer.
Yes.
And whereas if I was able to do it on paper and then it's the way we do things, you do it on paper and then you poll the answers. The other good thing about that system is you've also got a receipt.
I like
in essence,
earlier.
because and that really, it means that there is no room for my Zapper wasn't working, and especially if a battery starts dying, you're not 100% sure, or I think I entered the wrong one by mistake, and they can't lie as well. They can't change it retrospectively.
Yeah.
They can't But yeah, so I think there's it leaves less room for manoeuvre on the students.
I picked up when you said that earlier and thought that's the way actually I might end up going.
And it also involves less excruciating waiting for a minute.
Yeah.
I mean, this feels quite mechanistic, very paced. You're controlled to
yes.
thing. Whereas, yeah, as you say, if you've got 10 minutes to spend just sort of thinking about your answers in a kind of slightly more focused, mindful kind of way, then that.
The receipt is the paper script.
Sorry, no. You have your paper script, and that gets handed in. But you've also filled out a form where you say, I've put, for question 1, 4, 2, 3, and that gives you, and then the student takes that away with them, and then when they get the mark back, and obviously they'll hopefully have had the correct answers as well, they'll be thinking, no, I should have got 17 out of 20, you've only given me 14 out of 20, something must have gone wrong, and then they challenge it. And that happens, what we found is we got far less errors with the entering than we did with the paper markers. Which was
are these exams, or are these preparations for practice? In which case, I take the point later in an exam paper you see something that triggers an earlier question. Well, that doesn't happen in real life. That might happen in an exam.
But then in real life you wouldn't be under pressure to, if you were unsure of it, you might be able to go and refer to something.
Yeah, that's true.
But, yeah.
Just one thing. How have you encountered the potential that midway through an exam, the computer that decides to shut down or something disastrous happens?
Plan B was to take paper copies or multiple choice and really get backup for in case it did. That thought was crossed on mine as well.
Do you have those pre-printed OCR sheets?
Yes, yeah, could do that.
Doesn't TurningPoint back itself up quite regularly?
It will be, yes. If it was to crash halfway through, there is a backup folder that does back up what's happening. So to the point of where it would have crashed, it would have still stored all those responses.
The problem is that now, at come examination board time, you now have a serious disruption to an examination, which is beyond the student's control. So it's sort of, students now have a chance to appeal if they're borderline, which they may not have had if they were just, like, I haven't got a sharpener, so my pencil broke.
Sure.
Also, I'll get 5 minutes signs up on quickly, sorry to interrupt the discussion. And also there'll be no graph. Because in exam condition, I don't want them to think exam condition, I don't want them to get distracted by the yes, or oh my god, no, I didn't get that right. Now I've got to think about the next question now. So there's no graphs on the way here, so it feels, I think for a student perspective, it's going to feel quite strange. They're not going to get any kind of feedback along the way. There is quite a long time for a question to think about it. I'll skip through these because
how many marks are these worth? Say each test as a portion of the module?
There's 3 course tests, which together contribute 50%.
So it's quite high.
Pretty important.
We also haven't pressed button 1 at the end because my thinking was that if they're working at the beginning and they work at the end, what happens in the middle is down to the students. That was my thought along the way. Although I haven't revised my thoughts very much along the way, thinking about if they have this paper receipt of what their things have been at each point, then it is useful if there is some sort of discrepancy or negation discrepancy. So that's one thing that's allaying my thoughts somewhat. So that's basically that's an important ingredient, that last slide there. This is my last slide here anyway. I just reiterate the point really, I think the key things that they do increase engagement, they do promote interactivity. The instant feedback is useful for students, it's useful for staff. It can be used to promote student-centered learning, as we've seen on the way from today, it can be used to promote discussion rather than just being multiple choice questions being aimed at itself. And it can be used for formative and summative assessment. Thank you very much for your time and your attention here. Hopefully you've been some interesting things. There's one last slide. I lied. Thinking remember at the start of the day and at the end of the day. So thinking now and being here all day and at the end of the day, if you'd like to just indicate on here. Here's where we are here. And this is just a slide, if you're aware of comparative questioning slides, perhaps you do use those, you're aware of these, but useful for debates where ideas can change. And it's quite nice how you, again, you can link the two slides for the comparative questions, and then you get a graph that puts both those graphs on one graph, and you can look at the differences there. And it's saying the first slide is now showing in green, the second slide is showing in red. So this is another one that's quite useful then for perhaps debate situations where you can have a contentious argument, get students to present in groups either side of an argument, and then repoll at the end. And it can sort of be used then to show how opinion's been swayed by the information that's been delivered. So that's just another example of how you can use turning point as a means of facilitating debate. I swear that's the end of it now, isn't it? Yes. Thank you very much for surviving to the end of the day.